gonna be one. Yeah. I see you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first day of the spring semester. My name is Mark Wu. I am the Henry L. Stimson Professor of Law at Harvard Law School, and I also serve as the Director of the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies here at Harvard University. It's my pleasure to serve as the moderator today. I also would like to welcome two individuals here. First, Christina Davis, who is on sabbatical this year, but has served as the director of the program on U.S.-Japan relations and is known to many of you, also an expert on Asian and Japanese trade policy. She happens to be here in town with us today. And I also want to welcome Consul General Takahashi from the Japanese consulate here in Boston. We have 6 co-sponsors for today's seminar, so let me just quickly acknowledge all of them and thank all of them. First, the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies, the Harvard University Asia Center, the East Asian Legal Studies at Harvard Law School, the Montefiore Romani Center for Business and Government at the Harvard Kennedy School, the Japan Caucus at the Harvard Kennedy School, and the Harvard Undergraduate Japan Policy Network. So again, I just want to thank all of the co-sponsors for today's event. But most of all, I want to thank our distinguished speaker and a former colleague of mine, Dr. Michael Beeman. He is a distinguished scholar and practitioner of international trade and U.S. trade policy and economic security. He has been one of America's leading trade negotiators with East Asia for the better part of over 2 decades. He served 16 years at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, and prior to that, 6 years at the Department of Commerce. Most recently, from 2017 to 2023, he was the Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Japan, Korea, and APEC under both Presidents Trump and Biden. And in that capacity, he led the negotiations of the U.S.-Japan trade agreements, including the digital trade agreement, as well as the renegotiation of the U.S.-Korea free trade agreement. He is the author of Public Policy and Economic Competition in Japan, as well as this latest book, which I recommend to all of you, Walking Out, America's New Trade Policy in the Asia Pacific and Beyond. It's published by Stanford University Press in the Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center. It's available for purchase on many online bookstores and I think in some of the local bookstores as well. But most of all, I want to welcome Dr. Beeman back here to Harvard because prior to his illustrious career as a U.S. trade negotiator, he was a postdoctoral fellow here at the program of U.S.-Japan relations during the 1997-1998 academic year. So with that, I hope you all will join me in welcoming Dr. Beeman and offering a warm homecoming here to Harvard. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone for coming. And yes, it is a homecoming. It's really, I haven't been back in more than 20 years. And so it was a quaint brick building at that point, and now it's this illustrious center. But I'm positive that the level of activity and scholarship and research and work that's going on here is as intense as it was that I remember it back at more than 20 years ago. So as Mark mentioned, right after I finished my postdoctoral fellowship and ended up publishing my thesis based on the time I had here at Harvard, I went straight into government and I started a government career and decided to look at all of this from the inside. And I had a fascinating ride, but left government in early 2023, so just barely over 2 years ago, to leave and to go to Stanford and to write about U.S. trade policy and just historic fundamental shift that's going on. No one was really, I think, interpreting what was going on correctly. And even I had to spend some time figuring it out myself after having come out of government to understand what was really going on around all of us and sweeping over Washington in the way that it was. And I also wanted to have a chance to teach at Stanford, which I did. I taught a class on trade politics and just to kind of dabble back in the world of academia. So I'm really at home and really feel comfortable here. This is actually around my 21st talk since the book was published. I've done them since mid-October. I have like 10 to 12 more before the end of February. And but some are very particularly special, and this one is very special for me. But let me talk about the book, because I think, the whole point of the book is to really help reflect and understand and interpret what has been going on and why things have changed so much. Because I think without that understanding of exactly how the US got on this track that it's on today, it's very hard to talk about where it may go. It's very hard to talk about how other countries should view it and look at it and deal with it, and adjust to it, or try and force some accommodation with it. So let me just briefly go back through history just for a minute or two, just to talk about how the US got to where we are today. And of course, I think it's fair to say that it's no understatement to say that America led the global trading order for 75 years, whether you liked it or not, whether you thought it was accommodating or the rest. Certainly America's leadership role was instrumental, and its absence is also unbelievably sort of a chasm of lack of leadership that we're seeing today in that system. The system was created out of a kind of a chaotic long-term period of US trade policy in the 1800s into the early 1900s. It was a vision of President Roosevelt. Here he is on the campaign trail, trying to become president in the middle of the Great Depression, talking about trade on the campaign stump, and the need to consent to the reduction to some extent of some of our duties or tariffs in order to secure a lowering of foreign tariff walls. The issue at the time was, for example, US farmers had excess surplus. They wanted to export it. US had raised its tariffs so high, other countries raised their tariffs in response. US couldn't export this, and it was seen as a critical tool to get out of the Great Depression. So to begin the process of easing tariffs down, not a free trade speech, but nonetheless a let's think about this again speech. But by the time of, within 10 years later, the whole goal that Roosevelt had for this kind of vision for US trade really took a different turn, because it became clear that trade tensions were adding to the conflicts that were going on that had erupted into World War II. And literally just before the beginning of the war for the United States, he agreed with Winston Churchill in the Atlantic Charter on the importance of a post-war vision and the need to have a trading system, a rules-based system that was based on the fundamental principle of equivalent treatment in trade. So here in the Atlantic Charter with Churchill, he commits America to further the enjoyment by all states of access on equal terms to the trade and to the raw materials of the world, which are needed for their economic prosperity. So this is the global vision of the rules-based system that was already in Roosevelt's head in 1941. So I just go through this history because it's important to kind of think about this in terms of where we are today, which is the unwinding of this. But this was a commitment America made for many generations and decades. And this was the last US president really to kind of honor that commitment and goal. I can see my screen, but oh, there we go. It came back. We'll see if the system stays stable, and I can of course speak without the presentation here. So the US during this time had tremendous clout over what this system was, what it did, what the rules were, what the rules should be, and I was always making consistent adjustments to the system, but the US was very much out front, working with others, and it was very combative at times. But essentially now what we have is a situation where the US is walking out on its own vision, its own rules, its own approach, its own demands of others that it made over 70 years to commit to the system and to maintain the system in spite of a various range of difficulties. The system was far from perfect, but it reflected the US's own rules and interests. So what is walking out? What do I mean by this? Walking out in the trade world, I mean, it's familiar, I think, in other contexts as well, of course. In one way, it could be a protest move, right? You're a trade negotiator, you're having trade talk, your foreign counterparts are saying or insisting on something that you just cannot accept, and you're going to protest that and walk out of the room. And that's kind of the dramatic way. I've done it a couple of times with Japan. Japan has done it once on us. So, this is what we do. This is outrageous. We can't sit here and have a discussion any longer. We're, essentially, oftentimes walking out is a tactic, right? It's a negotiating tactic, and it can be very subtle. It can mean really not even engaging anymore with your counterpart until something changes, some kind of condition or situation changes in the course of your negotiations. Or it can be used in a more strategic way. But the reality is that if you're ready as a trade person to walk out, either you have to have a lot of leverage to force this change in the dynamic of the negotiation that you're seeking, or you have to have a pretty good tactical plan as to how you're going to get back to the table on the terms that you want in order to get there. But the reality of what's really been going on, of course, is that the U.S. is, been walking away, and I'll get to that in a second. Don't take my word for it. Listen to U.S. political leaders over the last 8 years. Words like renegotiate, words like withdraw, words like terminate, you can all understand whose voice that is in, and those are all walking out words. You also, in the Biden administration, they would talk about the trading system as being part of the problem, or the need to write a new story on trade. This is also walking out language. This is an attempt to identify problems with the system that they want to fundamentally reset and fundamentally change, and to go in a very different direction. So the question really is, does the U.S. have the leverage to walk out and get what it wants? Or is it just going to end up walking out symbolically because it knows what it doesn't like, but not really have a strategy to get back in the room and to negotiate what it really wants, and therefore walk away from its trading commitments that it had for about 75 years? So what is America walking out on? So I'm going to go through what looks like a pretty complex series of different pieces of what trade policy looked like 10 years ago and what it looks like today, U.S. trade policy. This is not to confuse you or to be a quiz afterwards, but this is actually why I use the video presentation, because it gives a very clear picture of the before and after, and just how fundamentally different the U.S. is approaching the system today compared to just 10 years ago. If we had had the same presentation, what it would look like. So, the typical U.S. trade policy 10 years ago and into previous decades was, living up to the core principle of non-discrimination in the WTO. This is Roosevelt's equal terms focus, right? And so this was equal terms by providing the same treatment by and large. There are exceptions with different countries of the system, and also between foreign imports and domestic products. The U.S. also was supporting the dispute settlement mechanism, which was a peaceful way to resolve disputes, very much a part of U.S. vision. The U.S. was also involved in liberalization negotiations in the WTO, either parts of large groups of countries or the WTO membership overall. The U.S. was also very involved and active in rule negotiations in the WTO of different kinds. This is just one example of one of the negotiations that was going on 10 years ago. And then the U.S. also had a very proactive bilateral and regional free trade agenda. Of course, it was negotiating and reach agreement on the TPP. It was negotiating with the EU on a massive trade agreement. So this was kind of a continuation of what had come before. The U.S. also had a program to give tariff preferences to developing countries. So the GSP, Generalized System Preference, was a program accounted for about 1% of U.S. imports, so not a big, important part of U.S. trade, but it was to provide zero tariffs for poorer countries on products that generally were not made in America, generally was not a competition, and it was seen as a win for importers. It was seen as a win for developing countries to help them improve their economic situation. It was very important to some of these developing countries as an opportunity that the U.S. provided in the system. So here's how this picture has now changed. This is kind of what happened over the last 8 years, and I haven't brought it into the last 2 weeks, but you'll see what I mean. Basically, the U.S. has pretty much given up on honoring the non-discrimination principle. It is discriminating by using different tariffs rates for different countries now. So that's not okay. U.S. Started discriminating in terms of the preferences for electric vehicles with trading partners around the world. Some got preferences, some didn't, most did not. The U.S. broke the WTO dispute settlement system to amicably settle disputes and left it broken. So the U.S. kind of decides on its own whether it's complying with the WTO agreements or if they matter. The U.S. completely has not engaged in any multilateral trade liberalization negotiations. So I'm just going to take that off the list. That's no longer happening. The U.S. did continue to negotiate in rules and trade in these areas. The Trump administration added e-commerce work, for example, but the Biden administration, by and large, kind of took that off the list. So I just took it off again. We have traditional free trade agreements gone. We're not doing those anymore. Instead, we're renegotiating trade agreements that we already had, going back to fix the past. This is walking out on the past obligations in order to get something different and new. So we have the renegotiation of NAFTA, we have the renegotiation of PORUS, Korea agreement, we have the negotiation with Japan to get back some of what was given up when the US withdrew from TPP. So those are just examples of kind of, more, instead of a forward looking, it's more fixing the past, basically. Then the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, did start negotiations with the UK and Kenya for a new kind of free trade agreement. The Biden administration then came in and wanted to have nothing to do with trade liberalization with anyone, and then took those and turned them into something else, which I call a deconstructed trade agreement, which means no tariff liberalization anymore, taking all the tariff liberalization out of the trade agreements, more on cooperation, added Taiwan, negotiated IPEF. Now the Trump administration is back. IPEF almost certainly is going to be wiped off the map. So just pretend that is gone. And then Taiwan, I'm not sure what will happen. I'm not sure they'll be doing any more of these agreements. So this all can change. And then for developing countries, this effort to help lift developing countries out of their situation through providing preferential access to the U.S. market is the Congress has not been able to renew it for 4 years and running. There's no sign that it's going to, and so I'm just going to take that off completely. So this is the 10-year later picture. This is the decade where we are as of 2 weeks ago picture of U.S. trade policy, just fundamentally in every area different. So that's just to drive home the point of what we're looking at. So with that in mind, why is this happening? Well, I think this is the most common reason that you hear spoken time and time again as to why the U.S. went in this new direction and this new challenge. And without going into details, it's undeniable that China is an enormous pressure and challenge and cause and factor in a lot of these decisions. But if it were that simple, my book would be half as long, basically, because it's not. And there are a lot of other justifications that both the Trump and the Biden administration have used to explain why or justify why they're breaking the rules, why they're doing things differently, why they're going to go in this direction, basically. And just some of those, so China is on the list, so we're going to keep it on the list. But some of those other justifications include things like, well, here we go, economic security of some kind, or issues like the environment and justifying discriminatory trade actions. The trade deficit is a focus of the right and the left. The need for policy space or regulatory issues, globalization, policy toward big tech, and the rules in trade is another area. Labor union rights, whether there should be too much or too little of that in trade agreements. So this looks like a pretty scattershot list of justifications for the U.S. to walk out on its past commitments. However, there is a pattern, and the pattern is revealed if you just draw a line through the middle and you look at the top and you look at the bottom. the top issues are all revolving around some kind of issue of the impact of what's going on overseas and trade with the US on the United States in one way, shape, or form. This is the traditional foreign dimension to trade policy. So be it China, be it offshoring and globalization, be it imports and supply chains, be it sovereignty that the US has given up in the WTO, be it the trade deficit as a loss, quote unquote, for the US, be it economic security and concerns that what's going on overseas and how that's affecting the United States. All of those issues are external, going on outside, and they were being reflected back as concerns in the United States about US trade position. The bottom, however, are issues that are being fought about in terms of the trade rules between the progressive left and the new right, the Trump right, but there's bitter, unresolvable disagreement domestically in the United States on these issues. And the extent to which those are reflected into trade rules, that the US always was reflecting its own system, its own values, its own priorities into the system. There's bitter disagreement going on down at the bottom, so lack of consensus. So what you get is this agreement at the top level between the progressive left and the new right, which are now formed the center of US political system. These are the mainstreams of both parties now. And this is us as in the United States versus them as in the world. And they look at all these issues as a threat, and trade is a greater source of harm than of opportunity. They agree that all these issues are problems that have to be dealt with in one way or another, and the need to walk out if needed to solve them or to address them. At the same time, in the bottom, to the extent that the US has any vision for new rules or any vision for trade that it's looking for from its trading partners, this is United States versus United States. There's no agreement on these issues. And this is where you get the United States coming in and flip-flopping between administrations. The Trump administration wants this, the Biden administration wants that. Now the Trump administration is going to throw all that out and go back to what it wants. And this is this inability to have a vision and to reflect into the system what the US wants anymore from the system, except for the agreement at the top. This is where both sides are focused. And this is why you see what you see in terms of US trade policy is focused on the top where there's consensus and where both sides are pushing in a similar direction. And then you get this flip-flopping at the bottom where the US looks like it's unreliable and unpredictable going forward. So I hope that helps illustrate the why. But what is really driving this? Well, you may or may not agree with this statement that America is exceptional, but I think we can all agree with this statement, which is America is exceptional in the nature of its political divide. Poll after poll after poll internationally in the United States shows the United States is highly divided politically compared to other countries. This has had tremendous consequences, and this has been going on in a real way in terms of Washington politics for, there's always politics as usual and division. The level of exceptional division is very high and has been this way for the last 10 to 15 years. And it's being reflected back into US policy in many ways, including trade policy. So let me just briefly run through this, which is how this is so different than the system the US set up. So what we have today is political polarization in the United States. So what does polarization do? It has led to the far left and the far right, which are now kind of the middle of their parties, focusing on everything as a zero-sum game in politics. What is zero-sum? Zero-sum is the sense and the belief that if one gains something, then the other is losing something, or if the other is gaining something, I'm losing something. And so there's a need to fight against losing anything to others in the system. So with that, what it does is feed populism in many regards, because this zero-sum polarizing, putting two camps in opposite sides is essentially is causing this rise of identifying groups as this is the pure or the correct group, and then you have the corrupt or the wrong group, or the one that has to be opposed, basically. So in the international world, what this also does is feed kind of a soft form of nationalism, because one of the great focuses on the need to focus on nationalism is the desire to reassert sovereignty of some kind with the state's role in the world, basically. So set against the rules-based trading system that the US created and helped develop, it's all in fundamental tension and conflict as to where we are today, because rules-based trade is based, of course, on the positive sum idea that trade is ultimately in everyone's interest. Maybe it's in the interest of one country for a period of time more than others, but if everyone's gaining, basically, if all boats are, if it's a rising tide, lift all boats kind of, thinking, obviously. The extent to which it provides stability to the international trading system and predictability. To the extent there's conflict is typically between developed and developing countries over what rules should apply to which side. The whole focus is to facilitate peace and peaceful resolution of disputes. And the whole point of this is to negotiate commitments. And when you negotiate commitments, if you look at the other side of the ledger, you're taking away from perceived sovereignty. Basically, you're signing yourself up to abide by obligations. But now in this new zero-sum world, that is seen as a threat to your nation, basically. So that's where you get this tension that goes back and forth. I'm going to jump through the next one just for sake of time. But just to emphasize one thing that's at the very top of the next set of slides, which is just to identify again who the groups are here in this zero-sum world that's coming out of the American political beliefs. You have foreign countries as them. You have multinationals when they're exporting, or when they're offshoring, when they're working overseas and exporting back to the United States, their products and services. They're seen as agents of globalization, very much viewed by both the left and the right now as them in this process, very similar to foreign countries. Then on the domestic side, you have the right and the left are fighting, as I mentioned, at home. I'm just going to skip over the rest of that. On the domestic side, they're fighting over issues at home. So you have the new right and the progressive left cannot agree on anything, except that trade is a source of harm in the external dimension. And so you get this conflict that's going on. So the result of all of this is the US is walking out either on itself or on others in terms of how it's approaching international trade. So what this has done is to implode and explode the bipartisan consensus on trade that existed in Washington for 70 years. Everything is flipped on its head. And this is what you're seeing in terms of the trading system. Now, I don't want to, I put this slide in because I don't want to be too Pollyanna about what trade is and how wonderful it was. And it was a very, conflict, very difficult. This is what trade negotiators did. It was more like this. This was more the picture of what international trade was like even during its halcyon days, glory days of the last 70 years. But what this does, though, is leave us with the following picture. So just to summarize, America's new trade policy is, and I feel very comfortable here, and we are 2 weeks into the new Trump administration, highly confident and comfortable in my conclusions as to where we're going, which is these are often grounded in zero-sum assumptions about winning and losing, not about rules. It's fueled by exceptional political division in the United States, not just a China issue. It rejects the trade status quo. This is where the left and the right are now agreeing on trade with discrimination is okay. It's also at the same time rejecting the US status quo. So there's no ability for the United States to reflect into the world's trading system what it wants anymore from the rest of the world. And just to throw this in, going back to Roosevelt, here we are back in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Not a great place to be. So some implications. This is America's new normal for now. As I was saying before, it's just if Harris wins, it would have been similar, but not as intense. If Trump wins, it would have been similar and very intense. As I said, it was like 18 Mack trucks going down the highway, and that's exactly what you're seeing. So this is why I use the word supercharged. Difficult to unwind later. Like, how are we just going to keep going down this road? And how do you pull back. It took Roosevelt and a Great Depression to pull back from this kind of tariff, the U.S. trade policy of the past that President Trump wants to return to. So can we even get back once you begin to impose protection in the U.S. market? There's very little consensus, as I mentioned now, on what the U.S. actually wants, though, other than walling off the United States. The U.S. is going to continue to be a drag on the WTO and on the international system. Not saying that the WTO was not already in trouble. It was, and it is. The U.S. is piling on to that in great ways. Discrimination is the feature, not the bug, of the new U.S. trade policy. New tariffs, Trump and Biden both were, of course, they had a legal thing they could hook themselves on, but that's not what U.S. trade policy and approach was. Biden administration used discriminatory subsidies, so this is kind of a new thing. One thing that's really, I think, now becoming much clearer, obviously the whole case with Colombia in the last 24 hours has made this present, but even before that, even in the Biden administration, once the U.S. and others, and this is true for any country, starts discriminating against its trading partners, it creates an enormous number of foreign policy problems that are going on under the surface in terms of U.S. relations with its allies and with its adversaries, both. So this is really boiling and roiling the number of issues that foreign policy people, presidents, secretaries of state, but trade people and others are having to deal with in their foreign relations, the more that the U.S. is separating itself from adherence to the rules and kind of deciding what it's going to do and when it's going to do it. So I say that. I also just, obviously, other countries can't just sit still while this is going on. They have domestic politics too. The U.S. is discriminating or hitting with tariffs. Other countries have to respond. They have to deal with their own politics. And so you get this race to the bottom of tit for tat kind of trade actions and dynamics, which is headed in a very slippery slope kind of way. So this is kind of the issue that I raise here, which is the extent to which there is any positive energy to restore, return, value the international trading system as it was or as it should be going forward, as it is. Countries like Japan, and there are others, of course, in the space, are really going to be tested, I think, in this area, because as much as the U.S. is trying to pull this all apart for its own purposes, will others step in to try and save the system? So whether or not there's something to come back to in the future for the United States will really, I think, depend on the ability of these countries to moderate among themselves their how they deal with one another in order to kind of keep the system, at least, among themselves, put it in the freezer for the United States for now, and see if the United States wants to come back at a future date. So we'll see what happens there. So I think that's a topic for discussion in terms of relations with the world. So that is a sober summary of my findings. And it was really motivated by a strong sense in my own work as a trade official that domestic politics, and we all knew at USTR, this was a very deep undercurrent going on that was really sweeping and changing the way America is dealing with the world of trade. And so my goal of leaving government was to explain that, to at least have some sort of history of why these decisions were made and by whom and how, and to interpret this, basically to help, I think, others begin to understand what's going on and how to think about responding to it. So let me leave that there and turn to questions. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. Please note that the question and answer portion of this seminar is being recorded, and we plan to post this online, and that will include audience questions. Our tradition here is always to turn to one of our visiting scholars to ask the first question. So I'm pleased today to turn to Professor Gemma Kim of Meiji University to pose her opener question. Professor Kim's project this year is titled The Politics of Economic Security, Japan and South Korea's Geoeconomic Strategy in the East Asia Regional Order. So Professor Kim.
Thank you for your fascinating presentation. As we know, Japan is leading the CPTPP and China is dominating RCEP and putting the US in a very challenging position to reclaim its economic leadership in the Asia Pacific region. While I acknowledge it, that the IPEF represents an important initiative to strengthening the rules-based international order. It excludes tariff liberalization and a core element of traditional trade elements. I mean, you mentioned in your book. And in your book, you described this as a new kind of layer cake, lacking the essential tariff liberalization icing. I totally agree with you. And without these tangible economic benefits like the market access, the IPEF risks being perceived as just more symbolic than practical. And even if IPEF disappears under this current Trump administration, I think this discussion is still very important. So that's why I'm asking. So my question is, given Japan's leadership in promoting the rules-based international order through CPTPP and its success in strengthening the multilateral cooperation, how can the US address the concerns about the effectiveness of IPEF and region, its credibility and influence in the Asia Pacific? And then what are the broader implications of this for international economic governance? I would greatly appreciate your answer.
Sure. Right. So let me just start briefly with IPAF. IPAF principally was a series of domestic U.S. priorities that the Biden administration wanted to reflect, as I said before, back into the trading system. They wanted to reset and reconfigure some of the ideas, principles, and even some of the fundamental concepts of trade through IPAF. And this was a very difficult exercise for the rest of the world because they were all like, well, what happened? You know, 10 years ago, you're saying that this was the right approach, and now you're saying like we need to reconsider all this. So it had a lot of challenges, but it seemed like it was coming together. And of course, the U.S. shot itself in the foot in terms of being unable to deliver it when the moment came in November 2 years ago. Yes, I think the trade pillar of IPAF in particular, which was never formally completed and signed, is, I think, dead. There's no way that the Trump administration is going to go back to that because those were Biden administration domestic priorities that they were trying to push into the system. And so to my point about flip-flopping, they don't agree on that. So it's kind of done for. So, right. So the point of what kind of vacuum does this leave in the region? Well, I think the Biden administration, unlike the Trump administration, this is one different area of difference, did feel there was an importance for the U.S. to be active and to be engaged in the region in a regional way. So IPEF was the answer to that, right? But that's not going to happen or work out. So, how much more time and investment are countries going to make they made it in TPP, and the U.S. withdrew from that. Then the Biden administration came up with IPEF and worked through that, and now we're going to abandon that basically. So I think the idea, just the whole concept of leadership in the U.S. in this space is just, pretty much a null set at this point. And I think the frustration and resources and time that other countries put into trying to find a way to relate to the U.S. and keep it engaged in the region, it's not going to be a priority for the Trump administration. And I think on trade, I think you can only be left at the altar too many times, basically, before it just becomes impossible. The Trump administration, because this whole sense that trade is a greater source of harm than opportunity, the Trump administration is just not going to care about CPTPP or RCEP, the degree to which others are organizing their own economic. It's not that they don't care or aren't aware, but they were so lightning focused on reorienting the U.S. domestic economy and in changing the terms of trade with the world. That is just not the priority. So, farmers and others will want those export opportunities, but the politics have really kind of shifted in this new direction of focusing on the U.S. market and U.S. opportunities. And if we get in the scenario of tariff escalation, others are retaliating. We're back in 1930. It's pretty hard to see how those export interests are going to be served. I think they will just not be a priority. So, yes, I remember very well having discussions in the Trump administration and the feeling about these agreements. And, I think the feeling is like others are going to do what they're going to do. And that's not our priority. That's where we are right now. Sure.
Michael, if I may follow up then with a second question. I'm going to take this in a slightly different vein, and I'm going to bring us more to the historical analogies of the 1930s. I think both the Biden administration and the Trump administration would argue that the real lesson from the 1930s was that the 1930s were a time of intense geopolitical conflict between two incompatible systems of how they want society to be ordered. And the Biden administration, the Trump administration will argue that we're in a similar time today. And the lesson of the 1930s was that policymakers spent too much time trying to create a rules-based order where these two conflicting systems could coexist. And instead, the allies should have spent that time strengthening their own defense industrial resiliency and maintaining their military superiority in order to deter a war. And they were unsuccessful doing that because their priorities were misplaced. I think both the Biden administration and Trump administration have tried to do that with American allies, particularly Japan and Korea. I want to just ask, as somebody who's been in the midst of those conversations, why do you think our allies have been so resistant to that being the interpretation of the right lesson from the 1930s? And in particular, I think, when it comes to trade policy, I think Wendy Cutler and Clete Williams have put out some very specific steps that could be taken by our allies in the Asia Pacific to strengthen the defense industrial complex through a trade agreement that have really been resisted by Japan and Korea that could possibly draw America back into thinking about greater trade liberalization with its allies were to adopt this type of framing. So just wanted to ask, why is it that everyone's stuck on 1930s as really this lesson about escalatory retaliatory tariffs as opposed to placing misplaced priorities that prevented war and having to use economic strategy in order to really steel up our defense industrial complex once more in order to deter war?
Sure. Yeah, I think all that you say, Mark, is I think very much correct in their thinking and in their approach. Obviously, in terms of how the U.S. is relating to allies and why allies have not been as forthcoming in this space, I think in great part is because they're being, in the midst of being forced to make this decision between the U.S. and China and these quote unquote competing systems. And, there are economic dependencies, there's reluctance for their own regional security interests and needs to make such a stark choice of we're going this way or we're going that way. And I think the Trump administration, I was asked the other day, what is the biggest challenge probably for Japan going forward? As much as it's going to be tariffs and retaliation and managing the U.S., I really think it is going to be this continued push and pull by the Trump administration to bring Japan and others along easy. Pick a lane. You're on this side or you're on this side. And that is really going to be, I think, probably the biggest challenge that countries in East Asia will have to face going forward. It is, as much as the lessons from the past, everyone has their interpretation of what those really should be and are. The reality, though, is that so many of the trade decisions the U.S. has made over the last several years have really not been as directly related to that question. They've been more domestic in focus and concern. Some reflect up into that space, but others are much more kind of homegrown concerns and issues so I think I guess the point I'm trying to make of this historical comparison is it also relates to a time of great conflict and generally in this space, much more lack of a kind of a bipartisan consensus in a certain direction, which was so prevalent between the 1940s and mid-2010s, basically. And so that was kind of the aberration in U.S. history in many ways, if you look at it through the whole stretch on trade policy of having a true bipartisan consensus in this area. Now there's an emerging new consensus, but the emerging new consensus is in the negative direction if you're a fan of the international trading order and system. And so there is every bit of attempt to reindustrialize the United States, to be better prepared, to expand the definition of national security to include all kind of economic security, basically to go back to some of those dynamics that you outlined. And it's interesting because the U.S. made a fundamentally different choice after the war, that there was another path rather than going tit for tat and having to go this route. if you could create a system that could manage this and everyone could grow together, then in theory, you get a more peaceful world. Well, I think that belief has run out. Whether it's true or not, we'll let historians make up their mind. But the belief in that system has run out.
Right. Professor Davis?
This is such a great book, and I've really enjoyed the conversation. I think that you're highlighting walking out as both a negotiation tactic and maybe a real walking out of we no longer think trade is in our interest. And you highlight it can be both. And that is a common bargaining problem. Like when we think war is always a waste, if only Russia and Ukraine could have negotiated and avoided the horror. Union striking is always a waste. Boeing on strike for months, neither side wins. And so our theories will say that misunderstanding, lack of information causes those breakdowns and failures, where you don't know how strong or how resolved you are. And it is a failure. And so as we run into a trade war, part of it is exactly what you highlight, that nobody is sure if the US is doing this as a negotiation tactic or a full walking away. And since you're one who's been in the room negotiating, is there any way to fix that as process? Like you talked, I love the chapter about the TPP and that it was the false promise that it was also going to help foreign policy, and that actually negotiations should always make the deal delivered on economics. And you go back in history to say, when State Department did trade, it gave too much to foreign policy, that early 40s period. And Congress pulled it back and said no. Right. And I think your implication is we got back to doing too much foreign policy with trade. We should just do it on the economics. But does that mean we need to change who's making trade policy? You know, Trump is saying put USTR back into commerce, or is Congress the one who knows what's a good economic deal? But you do highlight there were foreign policy losses. So maybe actually the real problem is Congress and USTR are blindly harming foreign policy. And anyways, I would like to know what you think would be the right way to negotiate effectively and avoid misunderstandings, given that economics and security both are important.
Right. I think there's a real difference in approach in the two administrations with just the thinking and the, so this may answer it a little differently than you were expecting, but the Trump administration, and this is reflecting my own experiences from the first 4 years, had just a fundamentally different concept of foreign relations than I think was traditional for certainly in post-war US history, and really was different also in many ways from the Biden administration. You typically you would start with Japan, a country like Japan, you have an alliance, and this was kind of the defining feature. And then you have all these things underneath, and everything was managed under this sense that there was a greater partnership here. Trump administration just has a fundamentally different view where this trade, economics, transactionalism, whatever it is elevated to the same level. So it's a multi-dimension relationship with no particular center. There's several different things that are exploding or working at the same time, and so I don't think it's a lack of information. They know exactly what they want, and they in this zero-sum game, trade becomes a matter of results, not of rules, or it becomes a matter of trade deficits and not potential opportunities or fair play. Basically, it's all you can always calculate who's winning and who's losing because it is a zero-sum view of the world, basically. So it is a fairly different kind of dynamic than the Biden administration was always wanting to be friends again and to forge those relationships and alliances. And I think they were considering other points of view and the rest, but these domestic politics is what was really driving everything. So for example, in the environment and the EV subsidies that were passed that were discriminated against most trading partners in terms of them being offered. which, both the left and the right bitterly disagree over the idea of, first of all, spending government money on the environment. Number two, electric vehicles versus gas-powered vehicles. So all of those, you get this huge conflict going on. But the area where they would generally agree, if there was ever an agreement, was that if we're going to spend the money, it's going to be, to favor U.S. products and services. It's going to try and discriminate against imports, basically. So this is where you get the disagreement and the alliance. So when it comes to information, really, what took precedence wasn't the foreign alliances and wasn't the foreign relations. It was what was going on domestically and figuring out a way to deal with that in the foreign context, basically, because that was what was really going on. So that's kind of my way of answering the question. I think the information that they're paying most attention to is what's going on domestically. And then they're trying to either not caring about what others think and they're just going to do their thing, or they're just going to do their thing and pretend that they care, but actually just do their thing, basically. That's kind of the way the last 8 years looks like.
Professor Hall?
Thanks so much for really enlightening, not always cheerful, but certainly very enlightening talk.
Very sobering, I'm sorry.
Yes. I wanted to ask you, you framed your talk in terms of state actors and domestic politics within the United States. What happens if you toss in big corporations that are not really grounded in any particular country, but seem to have tremendous influence and probably would prefer a rules-based order? And if you could elevate them to the role of actor, how does the picture change?
Absolutely. And that's, if you remember, I did have that one slide where I made the point of multinationals as being looked at as them. That's foreign or U.S. multinationals, both. So to the extent that they are contributing or adding to the U.S. economy in some way in the United States, not through imports from the rest of the world, generally they are welcomed and seen as kind of on the same side. But the extent to which they are taking factories and moving them overseas or producing abroad as globally competitive companies, which they've been asked to do and have succeeded at it, but now are finding themselves on the wrong end of those decisions when it comes to the US market, that's where they are viewed very much as them and very similar in a vein to foreign countries. And both the Biden administration and Trump administration viewed them that way. Biden administration had a particular took that even further. There's a general dislike of large corporations in general for other domestic reasons, but that was very much kind of that component and drive. So right. So I think that's where these corporations lie, and they're just as stumped in trying to figure out how to adjust and have stable businesses as foreign trading partners are.
But you wouldn't say that they have the same degree of agency that like a foreign country would have.
I think the distaste for U.S. multinationals and others that are, using their model, as I say, the world was a place where in order to survive and be competitive and thrive, you had to be diversified, right? And they took advantage of that. But now all those assumptions are being flipped upside down.
Michael, if you don't mind, I'm going to open up to audience questions. What I'll do is I'll take 3 questions at a time, do one round, and if we have time, maybe do a second round. So if anyone has a question, if you could please raise your hand. Okay, so 1, 2, anyone else? Okay, back there, 3. So 1, 2, 3. If you could please identify yourself also.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I'm Candice. I'm a doctoral student here. I want to ask about the Beeman case and the implication for security.
Yep.
So the Beeman steel currently acquisition, US steel was blocked by the CBS. And then the argument is that US steel is national security. And after that, I listened to a podcast by CSIS called Trade Guys. And the commentary is that, so they think that it's not a good idea because that Japan is a US ally. That's the first argument. And second, it's just their comment that Japan's current economic status quo will not surpass US anyway. Mm-hmm. So actually I hear 2 arguments. The first is the alliance argument. Mm-hmm. Japan is the ally. So the security of implications that as long as I choose allies, there's no security concern. But the second is actually a balance of power argument.
Right.
Is that if Japan is as powerful again, like in terms of like an industry, like back in the 1960s to 1980s, the Japan-US trade war. So my question would be, like in your observations, that whether like security in trade is a balance of power narratives in essence, or like alliance narratives in essence.
Okay.
I'm Koshi Suzuki at this program, US-Japan program. And thanks for your presentation. It's intellectually very interesting, exciting. Well, not very cheering. My question is about PPP. If the United States is working out, another one, PLC, is trying to working in right now. And it isn't, as you know, pushing other members to support them. And Japan and Australia is, well, as far as I know, they are resisting that. That they can't hold forever, as you can see in the case of the RCEP.
Right.
So if Trump administration is not interested in trade or in other trading organizations or institutions anymore, Japan and Australia end up admitting them, or admitting China. What do you think their reaction, Trump administration reaction?
Oh, yeah. Right.
Okay, last question in back.
Yeah, so my name is Georgia. I'm a PhD student in government economy. So Trump's second term is very different from first term, which was based on still Huawei and steel, but today it's completely different. So I understand that domestic preference for both parties are different with regard to trade, but instead of unilateral tariffs, which will simply, as demonstrated by the past 30 years trend, allow China 12 times size of Japan in terms of population, if you think about 1980s, dominate the rest of the world in many, many industries, simply through global market force and many competitive advantages, for example, scale, currency, state market synergy, labor rights. And this one unilateral tariffs won't resolve aggregate trade balances. So I'll say, do you think US trade policy need a global solution instead of just unilateral tariffs, which won't work at all?
Okay. First on Nippon Steel, I mean, I think the struggle there's many struggles that people are having with the new US decision-making on these issues, but one thing that's very clear is that the traditional concept of national security that was used in CFIUS reviews and those kinds of actions is really transforming as we sit here today. It's changing to expand a much more broad definition of economic security as a part of what national security is. There's a lot I can go into as to why that's happening, but that's actually what's going on here. So I don't see it as much as and actually in many ways, it's more similar to the view that Japan has taken for decades on what national security is, to include economic security. So in certain ways, actually looking a little more like Japan or more like Korea. And the Trump people know this. And actually, I've had one person tell me, I think, Japan will understand what we're doing because this is just what they do, basically. And I think there's a lot to be said there. Not that different necessarily, but it is a huge adjustment and change. And whether the institutions that the U.S. has developed based on kind of a with due process and those kinds of things are just kind of being trampled on, basically. And so I think that's where the sense of unfairness is coming in. And I don't know that necessarily would be any different if it was the UK or India or Japan corporation trying to acquire US Steel. I think there's just a more fundamentally different view of these issues today than there was. That's a very simplistic, because we could talk for an hour about this one. On TPP, yes, in fact, I have exact words in my book that just as the US was walking out, Japan was walking in on its vision of this rules-based trading system. Joining TPP was a huge adjustment for Japan. going from a world of kind of vague rules and sympathizing and operating within the vague rules to kind of make the system as it wanted. It signed up for some very specific, very detailed rules that TPP, chapter after chapter went for. And so it was a big shift for Japan. And the issue of China and TPP, I think the Trump administration reaction would be, look, we were 100% correct. We told you that TPP was such a bad agreement that even China would be able to sign up for it and benefit from it. And so, we were proven correct if they let China in, that they don't have to change anything about their system because they can avoid, and get around it. It was too watered down and the rest. So I think that's their reaction. What it is and what RCEP is and the rest is the sense that now we have a situation where the US is really lightning focused on exports that are benefiting from other trade agreements that are coming into the United States somehow from those relationships. And so the extent to which if China is in TPP and has tariff-free trade with all these countries, the US is going to want to find more ways to wall itself off from those imports because they're seen as coming from China, essentially, and Chinese outcomes. Trump 2.0 is different than Trump 1.0. I agree. I think just my summary of this is that in Trump 1.0, they were generally still using the same coloring book that the US was familiar with on trade. They would draw outside the lines quite a lot in this coloring book in making up the new rules that they wanted. They tore a couple of pages out of that coloring book, but it was kind of the same template. It was just a very aggressive and different approach to it. I agree that what's going on today is a completely different coloring book. This is a world of not trying to fit themselves into the rules anymore, but rather to make the rules and set the terms and conditions themselves. So I think I really do believe that their intention is to restore some kind of universal tariff with the world, back to the days of the 30s, which was called a protective tariff at the time. And part of it is to close off these walls and these doors to imports from China that are coming through other countries. But part of it is to reset the terms of trade with the world. I think the president, when he came in, basically talked about a new paradigm on trade. That's exactly what I've been saying, which is what I mean by a new coloring book. This is a very different world that we're going to be facing in the next 4 years.
So with apologies to those of you who had questions and also to those online who've posed questions, please join me in thanking Dr. Beeman for that.